"If he can't pay proper dowry, he doesn't deserve my daughter," my father said, his voice filled with the certainty of someone who believed his word was law. Dowry is how a man proves his commitment. It's how he shows respect for the family he's marrying into. If your fiancé can't afford it, then he's not good enough for you. Case closed. My fiancé, Arun, stayed perfectly quiet during this entire speech. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. But when my father finished, Arun's mother, who'd been sitting beside him with a calm smile, pulled out her phone. She dialed one number, and when someone answered, she said simply, "Son, they're asking what my family can afford for dowry. Why don't you tell them yourself?" When my father heard who was on the other end of that phone, the color completely drained from his face. "My name is Priya Sharma. I'm 29 years old. And the story of my wedding, and my father's humiliation, starts with a dowry demand that my fiancé's family responded to in a way I'll never forget. The expectations around dowry in Indian families are complicated. I've always known this. My father had paid a substantial dowry when he married my mother. His father had paid a substantial dowry to marry my grandmother. It was tradition. It was expected. It was the way things were done. But I didn't believe in it anymore. And neither did Arun. We'd met in California, where we both worked in technology. He was a software engineer at a major tech company. I was a product manager at a different firm. We weren't looking to marry someone from our cultural background specifically. It had just happened that way. We'd met at a mutual friend's birthday party and had clicked immediately. For 6 months, we'd dated in complete secrecy. My family didn't know. His family didn't know. We wanted to be sure before we told anyone. When we'd finally decided we were serious, when we'd known we wanted to marry each other, we'd had to navigate the traditional introductions and family meetings. These are important in Indian culture. The families meet. They assess the match. They discuss logistics. And apparently they discuss dowry. My father had been pleased when I'd told him about Arun, a software engineer at a respected company. A good family as far as we knew. A respectable match by traditional standards. He'd immediately arranged a formal meeting at my parents' house in San Jose, and Arun and his mother, Mrs. Kaur, had come on a Sunday afternoon. The first meeting had been cordial, following traditional protocols. My father had asked about Arun's family background, his job, his education, his qualifications. Mrs. Kaur had been gracious and warm, answering every question with patience. She'd brought gifts, traditional sweets, an expensive silk scarf for my mother. She'd been everything a traditional future mother-in-law should be. Respectful, interested, clearly proud of her son. My father had seemed satisfied with the match. The second meeting, which happened 2 weeks later, was where things shifted. My father had called Arun's mother aside. I'd watched from the kitchen as he'd walked her to the living room, gesturing toward the couch. I'd known immediately what was about to happen. My mother had warned me. "Your father will want to discuss the financial aspects." Dowry. The conversation had started politely. My father had sat across from Mrs. Kaur and had smiled. The smile of someone about to discuss terms. "Mrs. Kaur," he'd said, "we're very pleased with this match. Priya is our only daughter, and she means everything to us. When she marries, we want to ensure she's well taken care of. This is why we discuss dowry. It's not just about money. It's about showing respect for the family." Mrs. Kaur had nodded, listening respectfully. "We've decided," my father had continued, "that an appropriate dowry for Priya would be 50 lakhs. That was roughly $60,000. This includes gold, cash, and household items. We expect this as a sign of respect and commitment from Arun's family." I'd held my breath. This was a significant amount. My father was essentially testing whether Arun's family could afford it, and more importantly, whether they would be willing to pay it. Mrs. Kaur had listened calmly. She hadn't gasped. She hadn't seemed shocked or offended. She'd simply nodded thoughtfully. "I understand," she'd said. "This is an important tradition. Let me discuss this with my family. We'll need some time to consider." The meeting had ended cordially, but I'd felt the weight of what had just happened. My father had drawn a line. The dowry was his test of worthiness. Arun had been quiet when I'd called him afterward. "My mom wants to handle this," he'd said. "She said not to worry. She has a plan." I'd had no idea what that plan was. A week later, my father had called for another family meeting. He'd wanted to discuss the dowry matter. Arun and his mother had arrived on a Saturday afternoon. They'd sat down in our living room, my parents on one side of the coffee table, Arun and his mother on the other. I'd been hovering near the kitchen, wanting to be close enough to listen without being directly part of the conversation. My father had opened the discussion. "Mrs. Kaur, have you had a chance to discuss the dowry proposal with your family?" "Yes," she'd said calmly. "We have." My father had waited expectantly. "However," Mrs. Kaur had continued, "before we discuss the specific amount, I want to be clear about something. We don't believe in dowry. Arun has never asked for it. Our family values don't support it. We believe that marriage is a partnership of equals, not a financial transaction." My heart had started racing. This was direct. This was challenging my father's core expectation. My father's face had hardened. "This is our tradition," he'd said firmly. "This is how we do things in our culture. Dowry is not negotiable. It's expected." "I respect your tradition," Mrs. Kaur had said, her voice still calm. "But our family has moved beyond this practice. We don't believe in it, and we won't participate in it." My father had stood up. "Then there's nothing more to discuss. If your family can't show proper respect through dowry, then this wedding cannot happen." It had been said with finality. The ultimatum was clear. Arun had looked at his mother. She'd given him a small nod. "Actually," Mrs. Kaur had said quietly, "there's something I think your family should know before you make this decision." She'd reached into her purse and had pulled out her phone. "Arun," she'd said, "call your father. Tell him what's happening." Arun had taken the phone. He'd dialed. Someone had answered. His mother had taken the phone back and had said the words that would change everything. "Son, they're asking about dowry. They want to know what we can afford. Why don't you tell them yourself?" There had been a pause. I could hear a voice on the other end, distant but clear. My father's face had gone completely white. Because the voice on the other end belonged to Arun's father, a man who, it turned out, was one of the most successful business leaders in India. A man whose company was worth billions. A man whose family name appeared in Forbes lists and business magazines. A man whose wealth was absolutely undeniable. My father had sat back down slowly. I could see him processing what had just happened. Arun had handed the phone to his mother, and she'd put it on speaker. Arun's father had spoken directly to my father, his tone respectful but firm. "Mr. Sharma, I understand you're concerned about dowry. I want to assure you that my son loves your daughter very much. But I also want to be clear. My family doesn't accept dowry. We never have, and we never will. Not because we can't afford it. As you may have realized, we can afford quite a lot. But because we believe that practice is demeaning to women and to the institution of marriage." He'd paused. "Your daughter is marrying into a family that respects her, that values her education, her career, her independence. We will not be participating in a dowry exchange. If this is unacceptable to you, I understand. But I want you to make this decision knowing exactly what you're rejecting." The phone had gone quiet. My father hadn't said anything for a long moment. Then quietly, I didn't realize who your family was." "Perhaps that's the point," Arun's father had said. "Your daughter's worth shouldn't depend on how much you pay to give her away. And your son-in-law's worth shouldn't be measured by how much he's willing to pay." The wedding happened 6 months later. It was beautiful. It was modern. It honored both our family's traditions without forcing practices that neither of us believed in anymore. My father didn't pay dowry. Arun's family didn't accept one. Instead, both families contributed to a beautiful celebration. My father walked me down the aisle. Arun's mother blessed us both. We exchanged vows that emphasized partnership and equality. And my father, in the months that followed, seemed to undergo a quiet transformation. He started asking me about my career. He started asking Arun about his work. He stopped making comments about dowry or traditional gender roles. I think the experience, being confronted with a family whose wealth and power far exceeded his own, yet who refused to use it to dominate or demand, changed something in him. It showed him that you could be successful, respected, and still reject practices that he'd always believed were essential. A year after our wedding, I was having coffee with my mother when she told me something. "Your father has been thinking about your younger cousin's upcoming wedding," she'd said. "The boy's family asked about dowry. Do you know what your father said?" I'd shaken my head. He said no. He told them that his family doesn't believe in dowry anymore. He said that if they wanted to marry his niece, they would respect her as an equal, not as a commodity to be purchased. I'd felt tears in my eyes. Because that was my father, stubborn, traditional, set in his ways, choosing to evolve. Choosing to reject a practice he'd grown up with and believed in deeply. choosing to see his niece as a person of value whose worth couldn't be quantified in rupees or gold. 2 years after our wedding, Arun and I had our first child, a daughter. When I held her, I thought about what it meant to raise her in a world where her father's family, my family, had rejected the idea that her value could be bought and sold. I thought about how close we'd come to not getting married because of an outdated practice. I thought about how my father had been willing to lose his daughter over a matter of principle, not realizing that the principle he was defending was one that diminished his own daughter. And I thought about Mrs. Kaur's brilliant move, not arguing with my father, not engaging in a debate about tradition, but simply revealing the truth. That Arun's family had the wealth to pay the dowry if they wanted to. They could have paid 50 lakhs or 500 lakhs without blinking. They could have funded my entire life in luxury. But they chose not to, because they understood something my father needed to learn. A woman's value isn't determined by the price her father can command for her. The dowry tradition is complicated in Indian culture. I'm not saying it's simple to reject it. I'm not saying my father was wrong to value tradition. But I am saying that sometimes traditions evolve. Sometimes they need to. Sometimes a family, even a family as proud and traditional as mine, needs to be confronted with a better way. And sometimes it takes the quiet strength of a future mother-in-law making one phone call to make that happen. My father still talks about Arun's father with a mixture of embarrassment and respect. He'll occasionally mention something he read about his company's latest venture. He seems to have come to terms with the fact that his son-in-law came from a family more successful and wealthy than his own. But more importantly, he seems to have come to terms with the idea that his daughter's worth, my worth, has nothing to do with dowry. That I was always valuable exactly as I was. That Arun valued me for who I am, not for what my father could afford to give him. In rejecting dowry, Arun's family gave me something priceless. The knowledge that I was marrying someone who saw me as an equal, who valued me as a partner, not a possession, who believed that marriage should be built on respect and love, not on financial transactions. And my father, in accepting this, gave me something else, the knowledge that he could change. That even deeply held beliefs could be questioned. That his daughter's happiness mattered more than maintaining tradition for its own sake. That phone call changed everything. It wasn't just about dowry. It was about what we value, who we value, and how we measure a woman's worth. In my family's case, we finally learned to measure it not in rupees, but in respect. In partnership. In the willingness to see women not as commodities to be exchanged, but as people to be honored. And that, I think, is worth more than any dowry could ever be.